Okay, so without further ado, I will invite Cornelia to the stage. What I'll try to do here is maybe take a step back to consider the major trends and emerging risks that might be impacting you as a sustainability professional in the coming years, but also to end on a positive note, the best practices and innovative solutions that we can offer. So, where is ethical compliance headed? And with all the data that we have and all the interactions that we benefit from with our clients, what are we seeing as the major trends for the coming years? So the first major trend is the fact that we are seeing a strong shift from voluntary frameworks that have been driven in the past 20 years by generally Western companies, which we're seeing this shift to a regulatory framework driven by, this time, the Western governments at state level, country level, or regional level. So why is that? Well, as Gabriel has mentioned earlier, we've seen in the past 5-10 years two groups coming together, so consumer sensitivity and the civil society represented by press and NGOs, who come together around well-publicized scandals. So the first one in the 1990s around with Nike and Adidas, but in the sweatshops, but more recently with the Rana Plaza in Bangladesh. And this has enticed governments to step in this field that was very much unknown to them before, and enact labor laws that are going to be game changers for the industry. So 3 examples among many that you've probably heard of. The first one is the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, the Transparency in Supply Chain law in California, and very recently adopted 2 weeks ago, Duty of Care law in France. So obviously the purpose is always the same. It's to institutionalize the responsibility of companies, of importers, brands and retailers, and to make them legally and penally responsible for any breaches of human rights in the whole supply chain. We're not talking only about the tier 1 supplier, so the first supplier, but they will be responsible for potential child labor or environmental scandals at the 3rd or 4th level of the supply chain. And you might say, yeah, but they probably don't even know that it exists, but that's just what's going to happen in the coming years. And I think that's very interesting because sustainability professionals and even now CEOs of companies are aware of that and will have to prepare, not only with annual reportings, but also with strong due diligence actions. Obviously, just to conclude on that, to help you navigate into those many frameworks, there are some differences. So the purpose is the same, but there are some differences. And some of those laws, regulations, are more binding or more enforceable than others. Some will only focus on a given country or on very big companies. For example, in France, more than 5,000 employees if you're a French company, or more than 10,000 employees if you are a foreign company. But just to give you a very striking example, in the Netherlands, there's a due diligence child labor law that has been adopted and is being confirmed by decree, according to which if the company fails to report a child labor case in its supply chain and it is found that there is a non-compliance, there will be a binding instruction and a fine. And if there is a repeat offense, the person considered as responsible, so that could be the CEO, depending on the legal status of the company, can go up to 6 months imprisonment. So I think this is a very striking and very interesting example of the fact that now how responsible the governments are considering the firms now. Another interesting trend is that there's also this shift that we're noticing from spotlight issues and very defined and very easy to identify issues like child labor. It's not easy to find, but it's once you hear it, you know what you're talking about. And so we've come from those issues to the more general notion of modern slavery. Modern slavery, forced labor, this is really the kind of a new number one enemy that we are hearing a lot about in the last 2 years. And so modern slavery, forced labor, it's very hard to define. It's an umbrella term that pretty much encompasses all the situations where a worker is coerced, physically coerced to work against his will. But it covers very different topics. It can mean literally a slave worker on a Thai fishery boat, but also a prison labor in China, or a migrant worker, for example, a Nepalese or Bangladeshi worker in a textile factory in Cambodia or in Thailand without any, whose passport has been taken by the factory manager. So a lot of different situations here. Just to give you a very quick illustration of how hard it is to tackle, we were participating a few weeks ago at the CDEX conference as an active member of the stakeholder group. There is a work group called Modern Slavery, and they've been trying for a year to define, to draw the lines, the scope of this issue, and they're still working on it a year later. And what it means in terms of challenges, and this is what actually Ines has mentioned earlier, is that you are not going to find prison labor, you're not going to find slave labor, physical coercion, physical abuse in the tier 1 of your supply chain, or if you find it, you can, but it's not so common now. You're probably going to find it a little deeper now in your supply chain, which means you will have to dig deeper. And something that is very interesting today, so this is really a new set of challenges, and so 3 actually. The first one being, well, you have to identify them. And I think that the example given by Ines earlier is very striking, because you think you have a supplier, but actually you have 84, or you're responsible for 84 units. And just to give another example, according to the Covadis 2017 barometer, 15% only of brands interrogated have a good visibility on their tier 2 suppliers, and only 6% of the brands declared good visibility on tier 3. So there's still a lot of identification work to do. But once you've identified them, well, how are you going to redefine your priorities? Are you going to take, and I know there are a lot of sustainability professionals in the room here, quality directors who also have a little bit of budget for ethical audits. Are you going to take this budget and go deep down on the supply chain and ignore all the tier 1 suppliers that you had finally taken under control, that are still not compliant, that you have, with whom you have to do a lot of follow-up audits? So how are you going to balance the two? And finally, once you've identified them, once you've obtained some means to reach them, what kind of mechanism are you going to use to visit them, audit them, and control them? Because obviously you can't arrive, just to take the example you were giving, you can't arrive in a 5-person embroidering tailor shop in Tamil Nadu with a 120 audit questionnaire. I think that after 10 minutes it's going to be very clear that the factory manager doesn't have the same level of maturity than a 10,000 worker factory in Shenzhen. So those are the challenges we are all facing. And well, now I'm going to ask you, so this is like if you could take your smartphones and out again, following the recent poll that you took with Gabriel, I'm going to ask you to open up the same Slido website as earlier and put the same hashtag and answer to this second question. So it's, does your company have a compliance-based or risk-based approach to ethical strategy? And I'm going to ask you to answer honestly here, because obviously you might want to say risk-based, but what we mean is, do you think that today what is driving your ethical strategy is covering a certain percentage of your POC, complying at all costs, being able to report on a certain level or number of audits, or are you looking at the risk of your industry, of your products, to drive your ethical audit strategy or your ethical strategy? You're being honest. That's nice. Okay, I think this is extremely telling, and thank you very much, because I was expecting... Well, we think this is the reality and of our clients today, of the industry, even though we see that a growing trend towards a risk-based approach, which we strongly encourage. So don't worry, you are in the norm, in the good norm, in the average. So major brands, European, American brands in retail, garment, footwear, hardware, electronics today are still reporting a classic social ethical versus environmental audit approach with, it's a very quantitative approach. So I've identified that amount of suppliers. Every year I've done that much audit that represents a certain percentage of my supplier park. This is with a X percent of good factories, Z percent of not okay factories, and this is what we'll be doing in the coming 2 years to drive improvement. And just to give you an example of that, we have a major USA hardware brand that I will not name, who still scores all of its suppliers indistinctly with on a 500 plus compliance point questionnaire, which you can imagine how long the audit is. And so this is what we see today. But we do have clients, and we do feel there's this really trend coming up, and we are actually encouraging this trend, and we really believe in it, as Gabriel was saying earlier, towards a risk-based approach. So what is a risk-based approach? It's basically looking at your supplier park and saying, okay, and working on a who's who of your supplier park. So who are my strategic suppliers, my family suppliers, people I want to be working with 20 years down the line, because they know my procedures, they know my quality expectations, they know my design, we've signed some patents, I trust them, and I would really like them to actually be ethical and compliant. Who are my one-spot, suppliers with whom probably not going to, it's going to be a very strong turnover with them, but I need them because they do very low prices. Where is my gray area? So this is the first point, and second point is, where are those suppliers? Are they in very risky countries? And what are they producing? Are they producing high-risk image products like toys? You don't want to have a photo in the press of a child doing a football ball. It's not very good for your image. But sometimes you have products that nobody's thinking of, like Christmas decoration, that are actually very, very risky due to the production process. So when considering all those criterias, and you can elaborate a matrix, a risk matrix, and you can say, okay, actually, this is where I need to go. This is where I need to put my spotlight. This is where I need to focus. And sometimes it's not going to be, 500 plus questions at, 100 suppliers. It's going to be maybe one type of questionnaire here, another type of questionnaire there. Sometimes in a very non-risky country, you will find out that you have a very strong structural safety issue. So you will want to do a structural safety assessment there. So a risk-based and an adaptive approach, this is what we are seeing from the ground. And the fourth and last trend is, we like to call this a too many cooks in this question, and this is for Sir in the second row who asked earlier. We are seeing, and you'll be happy to hear that, we're really entering an era of a collaborative and shared approach. So why? Well, we just want to give you a bit of background here, because it feels very interesting. In the first code of conduct, ethical supplier-oriented code of conduct, was only developed 20 years ago. So that's very little in the history. I'm not going to say humanity, I don't want to be dramatic here, but even in the history of the Industrial Revolution, of the 20th century, and even in the history of global outsourcing. So in 1996, exactly the same year, which is quite interesting, Otto in Europe, and Gap and Nike in the USA, same year, probably experienced the same scandals, were early adopters and developed a code of conduct. First one to govern and control their suppliers, plus started recruiting teams, internal teams, to check factories in China, Cambodia, etc. 2 years later, the first shared initiative, so the first member initiative to share audit tools emerged. It was in France, and it still exists today. But obviously, we've also mentioned the BSEI and CDEX that are more global standards. And as you can see, there's this acceleration from 0 code of conduct in 1995 to 900 code of conducts today. This is an estimation that we have. So obviously, what does it create? As you were saying, audit fatigue, a perception of a lack of value of the audit. And the good news is that around 1988 and around 2000 some brands, retailers, and importers came together to share best practices, audit tools, and most importantly, reports to avoid going back constantly in factories. And it's a very interesting figure. It was, for example, CDEX system that you probably all have heard of, so which is an ethical standard. It was created in the UK. It is already very much global with more than 40,000 members. Is adding every year 15,000 plus audits in its system, and they've estimated that they share approximately 40% of the audits. So just to complement on what you're saying, the audit companies are not the poor parent in this drive and in this trend. In 20, as Gabriel was mentioning, in 2016, so last year, audit companies made a very notable and important step towards improving the quality of, improving together the quality of ethical audits and sharing the same perception, the same level of expectation for an auditor. So basically, this is a work in progress. So we're very happy to participate to this work, and we are defining prerequisites, skills, and competencies that an ethical auditor should have to be, per se, allowed to carry out an audit for major brands and retailers. So this is for really the trans, and when trans obviously is a bit of a structural, has a bit of a structural resonance to it. We've also identified, thanks to data and thanks to what we feel what we see on the ground, we've identified some emerging risks that will definitely be impacting your supply chain in 2017 and that you will want to stay away from. And the first one is to touch again on what Ines was saying. What is really the goal of an ethical audit is to obviously check the working and health safety conditions in a factory to protect vulnerable workers. But we've come to notice with time is that it's always the same vulnerable worker within an active population. So you will have, and that's why in the questionnaires we're putting such a focus on children, pregnant women, seniors, because it's most often them who are, who don't benefit from the best working conditions. There's also another set of, there's another subgroup that is definitely very vulnerable. It's a migrant population. It's so interesting to read and to find out that in China today, you have 247 million migrants in China, which is a huge amount. And you also have migrants from, obviously, in Cambodia, Thailand, and Turkey, we will touch on that, migrants from other countries who I think are even more vulnerable because of the language issues, the fact that often don't have paper, and they basically are ghosts in the society. And we wanted to make a special focus on Turkey for anybody here in the room who might be sourcing in Turkey, European brands who are considering to do it. There is a direct consequence of conflict and instability, and a very striking example is this country now. With you're all aware of the Syrian conflict, and one of the direct consequences of the conflict is that Turkey has been hosting 3.2 million refugees from Syria since the start of the Syrian conflict. And I'm just going to we're giving you a lot of numbers here because we want you to do the maths, and it's quite striking. 50% of them are working age. 50% of them are working age, and so that would be, if you do the math, it's like 1.5 million refugees. So who will look for work? It's only 13,000 work permits were granted in 2016. So that's for the population who could work. But we also know that around nearly 700,000 of those migrants are school-aged, but not in school. So you might wonder, where are they? Because we know that they are not in official camps. So this gives you a pretty clear idea of how high the child labor and undocumented labor risk is in Turkey today. And to be honest, if you have operations in Turkey, I would strongly advise prioritizing this in your ethical audit strategy. And this, for example, we have a client last year who has taken this full on and requested literally 100 days audit. So that was 100% ethical monitoring for his operation in Turkey. And it was not useless. It's important to come every day to check incoming material, to check outgoing production, ensure that the subcontractors that have been declared are the right ones, ensure that every day they can't hide away the undocumented and child labor. Another risk that we are seeing, and that I feel that most sustainability professionals will have to touch on as soon as possible, is the fact that there is strong macroeconomic changes that are being observed today in previously low-cost manufacturing country like China, and those changes are seriously impacting the global sourcing map. So, two trends in China that you're probably all aware of. The first one, major labor shortage. Somebody mentioned that in the back during the question. Why? Well, first you have an aging population. So by 2030, 1/4 of the Chinese population will be aged over 60. So that's double compared to 2010. Second point is that you have a later, all these are good news obviously, but a later entry into the workforce of young people, because there's a higher higher amount of people going to university and higher level of education in China. The third sub-trend is the fact that more people with middle to high income are retiring earlier. So all this is leading to a shrinkage of the active population. That's the first point. The second point is that you have a significant increase in minimum wage. And a very striking figure is that this minimum wage in China has increased by 200% between 2004 and 2012. The average wage has also doubled since 2006. So to give you a very pragmatic idea of where China is located now in terms of competitiveness, its monthly minimum wage is now higher than India's and that Vietnam's, still lower than Malaysia, but obviously China cannot be considered anymore as a low-cost manufacturing country. And we've known this for some time, but we're really seeing a shift in sourcing strategies in the past 2 or 3 years. So what does it mean? It means that major USA and European brands are redefining and diversifying their supplier portfolio and their sourcing strategies. And generally the consequence is twofold. They will either go in a cost-saving location, which will entail very high ethical risks. So you've all heard about H&M in Ethiopia, for example, Disney in Myanmar, and you have Egypt. We want to touch down on Egypt because actually, probably you saw the global map that was shown by Gabriel earlier. Would you want to tell you that Egypt is literally the worst country in our statistics, in ethical statistics in 2016. We've only seen really bad things and zero tolerance issue coming from there. So this is definitely a high-risk area. Another potential consequence will be to go to closer sourcing location. So, for example, Mexico for USA brands. It's quite strikingly I think this was confirmed last year, but the Mexican hourly wage is now lower than Chinese hourly wage. So so obviously with a closer location, it's going to make sense to reattribute some of the sourcing there. And for European brands, Poland and Romania. This is not a risk in itself, but it's definitely something that you want to keep in mind in your risk analysis if you're having a risk-based approach. So So just to conclude on the risk, I think that an important risk, and it could be a trend, but actually it's becoming a risk, is that we're still seeing most brands and most of our clients being very reactive instead of proactive. So basically, they are waiting for the big bang, and we've already had one, which was the Rana Plaza in Bangladesh 4 years ago, with all the potential disruption it has brought in our industry. So two alliance and accord in Bangladesh, 2/3 of the Bangladeshi textile industry put under control in less than 3 years, a structural safety, more than 3,000 structural safety assessment, electrical safety, fire safety assessments. So why can't we bring the same disruption in other countries? And why are we still having this damaging top-down approach where we're actually this compliance-based approach, where we're pushing down the responsibility down the supply chain and asking the supplier to understand a questionnaire he has never seen before, and knowing that he will see maybe 10 or 20 others, and without trying to understand what he needs in terms of tools and budget to actually improve. And why did we put this section in risk and not in trend? Is because the consequence of that is that audits, which are actually a very, very positive and very important tools to your ethical compliance strategy, are being undervalued as a consequence. And it's definitely something to keep in mind. But hey, let's not finish on a sour note. There are some very actually positive things we are, best practices, and they're very positive innovations that we are observing and that we're also pushing to our clients and what we are really encouraging. So in terms of best practice, and I think this is really interesting because it's going to echo what Gabriel and Ines said, but a very important, I think the most important lesson here, and the takeaway that I would like you to bring home or to your office, it's that it's all about the approach. It's really all about how you're going to tackle the issue, because the issues are there, obviously. So I think that the result of the poll was really interesting. You still have a lot of people in this room still have a compliance-based approach. What you want to do now is maybe be clear about it, so the backbone. Why do you still have a compliance-based approach? Is it because your top management doesn't care or doesn't see the risk, the legal risk we talked about earlier, the risk image, so what is the opinion of the top management? Is it because your internal stakeholders are not on board or do not understand what being compliant entails, or maybe don't have the time to think about the risk? Do you have annual goals? And how could you change those annual goals to maybe cover the most risky areas? So be clear about the approach you have today. Another point is traceability and a supply chain visualization. So if you were really honest with yourself, what is the level of knowledge you have today on your supply chain? How many of your tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 suppliers do you know of? Have you carried out a due diligence analysis of your park? Have you maybe, and I'm going to give you a very illustrative example here. Have you sent a little Excel template to your purchasing team so that they could send it to their traders or agents on the ground or direct suppliers for them to fill? Then you can push it back up and see how many people they're working with. And finally, did you sit at a table with your supplier to actually communicate on what you were expecting in terms of compliance? So obviously they know they should not hire children. I mean, this is in the local law of most manufacturing countries. But have you been clear about your standards in terms of juvenile worker, in terms of living wage, health and safety? And have you also reassured them, saying, listen, I'd rather you be transparent and not hide and not do double records, and we take 2 years to improve, instead of you hiding everything, me getting a very good audit report, but all this being complete bollocks, sorry for the expression. So, and this, we offer a lot of we integrate a lot of innovation, and for example, on that point, like e-learning, so how to reach your suppliers 10,000 kilometers away, well, it's definitely one of them. And to conclude, a case study of one of our clients, a major French luxury brand, who we think embodies a shift, really embodies perfectly the shift between a compliance-based to a risk-based approach. When we started working with them, their internal teams, so everything was managed internally with an internal questionnaire and quality auditors going to factories and checking at the same time ethical points, so looking for zero tolerance points. They were not really trained. It was quite frustrating for them, and the information was not cascading properly internally. When we started working with them, they shifted responsibilities. So we became responsible for the ethical audits, and their internal teams became factory improvement teams. So they felt more valued. They had tools they could use that were our audits. So when they went to the factory, it was another conversation. It's a conversation when you say, okay, so I know you're supposed to do this. Actually, we've confirmed this order with you within 2 months. This is a critical point. To answer to your question, this is a critical point. Try to correct it as soon as possible. And to implement, for example, a software for timeout system to ensure that there's no excessive overtime, we're going to give you 1 year and we're going to accompany you. Another very interesting thing that they did is that they used AI as an ethical toolbox. And so basically, they use us to adapt to every risky situation. For example, if they have a factory with a high percentage of migrant labor, what they will ask us to do is a night audit or a neighbor audit. So we will check, the auditor will come the night before and look at what time the factory actually closes, when do the lights go off. They will interview guards, local shops, local accommodation to see where the migrant workers are actually living, etc. And finally, and this is really going back on what Gabriel said, they're keeping their eyes on the prize, which is continuous improvement. It's not compliance. What you want is actually your factories to improve, to install that fire door, to stop locking their workers, and to start implementing a comprehensive waiver hour system, for example. So it's really about accompanying them all the way to improve, so that you can do desktop reviews, you can do factory improvements. There's so many tools out there to do it. And instead of just expecting the factory to be good right away. And well, we talked about the damaging top-down approach. There is this very interesting initiative and very interesting. So we love innovation, and we always try to keep our finger on the pulse. And we're really happy to introduce Ulula as a worker voice initiative. Because we believe worker voice could be the next big innovation in terms of a bottom-up approach. And yeah, so thank you very much. And
Hi, everyone. I'll try to time myself. Thank you for being here and taking the afternoon. What wonderful conversations and dialogue and good questions. And we're really happy to be here and have been invited by AI. A quick introduction. My name is Vera Belazelkoska, and I'm the lead on projects and partnerships at Ulula. And I will quickly, so this is sort of the outline of what I'll try to cover. Briefly go through who we are, really what the rise and involvement of worker engagement technology, or worker voice, how it really works, because there's always some practical questions about that that arise. Worker engagement technology and how they complement audits, data for continuous improvement, and how worker engagement technology can actually provide that. And a few case studies in between to keep things a bit more interesting. So who we are. So we are a software and analytics platform that enables brands and suppliers to monitor and measure risk along their supply chain, and also create shared value with workers and suppliers. We leverage simple, accessible, inclusive mobile phone technologies, but we do also integrate with web and social media. And when we speak of this particular technology communication channel, we mean simple text message and interactive voice recognition, or IVR. And this to enable the worker to report on their actual working conditions in real time, directly through their personal mobile phone. So these are some of the tools that we have developed so far. An automated survey mechanism to monitor working conditions all the time. Alerts that administrators, brands, and suppliers can view on our dashboards in real time. Grievance management systems so that you can actually anonymize the system where workers can comfortably approach management and supervisors to raise any reports or any issues they have. And mass broadcasts, which are really important and can integrate really well with e-learning and different types of health and safety training and risks that could be communicated to them to decrease the damage of those risks. And just very quickly, this is how far we've come in our short existence. So we're right now operating in 11 countries. We have engaged over 100,000 users in 20 different languages. And we are able to do that because we have partnerships with telecommunication companies and operators across the world. We're based in New York and Toronto, but we have partnerships across the globe. Obviously, AI is a great connection for us as well, because they are always forward-looking and thinking about innovation and what is the next thing that could be the plus in the audit plus space. So just a quick introduction of sort of how we see the rise of worker engagement technology happening over the years. There are still 4 billion people that are offline. We're seeing greater traction in smartphone usage and Wi-Fi accessibility in factories and in certain areas, but obviously in the agriculture, food, beverage sector, extractive, it's accessibility to internet is really, really low. In India, for example, there's more people with cell phones, simple phones, than clean toilets. However, most of those cell phones are not smartphones. And even if they are, they don't actually have access to the internet because of the expense of data or because Wi-Fi is not very available. So this is a great opportunity to leverage until we get to higher connectivity. We see opportunity to leverage simple mobile technology that's accessible and inclusive. So the evolution of worker engagement technology, if you, and AI, both Gabriel and Cornelia, they touched on this, but the worker voice was sort of seen a bit more as a complementary tool to CSR. So within the CSR operations of companies, they started to think, okay, how can we really put the worker as a main stakeholder on the table and get some feedback about some of the projects that we're running, trainings, for example, programs that send their kids to school. But it wasn't until the Rana Plaza collapse that it started to, the importance of it and the shift towards implementation into operations started to happen. With the Rana Plaza example, and I'll contextualize it within the Toronto or the Canada space, but Loblaws, which is a large conglomerate that produces a fashion line called Joe Fresh, they had implemented an audit about 2 weeks prior to the collapse. They were saying that the auditing firm, also Canadian-based, had been compiling the report and had recently just passed Rana Plaza right before the collapse. And at the same time, we're hearing reports that there were workers who had passed away, whose phones were found, and pictures of cracks in the walls were on those phones. So we see there's a bit of a disconnect in kind of channeling that worker voice and actually producing data and real-time risk analytics from that. So there were early adopters in the space, quite a lot of pilot projects happening in Bangladesh, some in parts of northern India. But it wasn't until last year that sort of it really started to become more integrated into risk management and how can we leverage worker voice technology for continuous improvement. So not just to measure the risk, but also how can we leverage it to continuously sort of be in dialogue with workers so that we can create a bit more of a safer environment where workers feel trained, they have access to remediation of issues, they can report on risks and so on. And in the last year especially, we've seen a really growing trend of how can we, instead of position worker voice or worker engagement technology as a watchdog type of tool, how can we provide great value and communicate that value to suppliers so that there is greater supplier ownership in the process. So obviously, as Cornelia mentioned, the SEDEX conference recently was a really interesting space where we saw that a lot of companies and brands that are thinking about worker engagement technology were brought together by associations, and SEDEX being one, AIM and others as well, to think about how we can converge some of this data so that we're not going out conducting additional surveys that are not related to audits, having separate data sets, separate dashboards, and instead create something that is much more standardized and can be rolled out globally and can really decrease that audit fatigue that we spoke of in this conference quite a lot. So the SNL, the Social and Labor Convergence Tool, is something that's being developed. And for example, workers are one of the main 3 stakeholders identified by the working group for SNL convergence. So obviously worker engagement has a really, really strong space or seat at the table. So we've seen, sort of, these are some of the trends that we've noticed, that worker engagement technology has been used in over 25 countries now. Some of the early adapters were apparel and textile, but now we're seeing it more in food and beverage, electronics, and the toy industry. And obviously social and ethical auditors as well as consulting companies are starting to implement it into some of their processes, both for measuring the impact of some of their operations, but also integrating it as part of their audit or complementary to their audit. As I mentioned, industry associations are starting to move towards adopting some of these tools. For example, with AIM Progress, they have located a few service providers, one of them being Ulula, and they're going out to their members and saying, try this out and let's see if this works. Let's see what kind of data this provides. So we'll be launching a pilot in China in the next month. And we'll hopefully have interesting statistics to share. We have seen also an increasing number of service providers that are offering worker engagement technology, and also increasing partnership between service providers. So we have been brought to the table by organizations like SEDEX who say, this seems to be another channel of data collection. How can we try to standardize it so we're not actually replicating the same thing and causing it's both inconvenient for suppliers, but also for workers who are now going to be receiving many surveys via digital phones, and everybody who's collecting data is not actually communicating. So now we're even causing survey fatigue amongst workers, not just suppliers. So just a quick kind of how it all works. And so a worker engagement technology would normally be a SaaS model, which is a software as a service model. And that's how Ulula is, and we know other providers provide that as well. So there is a graphic interface that's accessible through a web channel that anybody can log into that has access, and differentiated access is normally the way to go. So suppliers would get access to some data and some tools, and the brands will get access to other sets of data. And then the connections are automatically linked, so everything can be configured directly from the software. And that the idea is that through that one user interface, you would be able to connect to a variety of stakeholders. And then real-time analytics are obviously where we're headed into, and sort of as the chatbots are picking up information, that information is being analyzed in real time. So this is just an example of a few indicators that we have worked on, but worker engagement technology will obviously always look at what are the standards, who are the major players whose audits and standards are being implemented by auditing firms, and kind of picking the indicators and the indicator clusters that they create so that we are indeed complementary to what is already happening when interviewers go into the factories, and also thinking about where are opportunities to fill certain gaps. So if there are certain questions that are too sensitive for an interviewer to ask a worker, how can digital technology that can be anonymous and the interaction can happen in the privacy of someone's home, how can we leverage that to ask those more sensitive questions? worker recruitment is a really important piece, and this is where we really have to think about how we can engage the suppliers and increase their capacity to both do the outreach with their workers, but also even collect the workers' phones. Between first-year suppliers, this tends to be much easier than second and third, but suppliers will then provide a file of the workers' mobile phones, not connected to names or any information that could be that could identify them. Systems normally tend to be encrypted so that as soon as a phone number enters into the system, it's immediately given a unique ID that is not connected to the number anymore. So any information coming in from that worker sits on a profile for that worker, but that profile is actually not connected to a phone number. And most of the providers, like Ulula, we cannot even tell who is answering what. So the idea is that as soon as interaction happens, there's 100% confidence in anonymity. So recruitment posters and information cards and billboards are other ways that worker recruitment can happen effectively so that you can really reach that sample size that you are looking for. And incentives are very interesting. There's ways to think about providing data and information back to workers so that they feel they're a part of the process. Because we've all taken surveys that we have contributed to, and then we never hear back what the results were. And then when we do, we're surprised, and we like that. We like to see where we fit. You know, you were amongst the bottom 20% who answered this, and you're like, wow, that is so strange. You know, those are interesting insights, and workers like to see the same. So this is where we try to work with suppliers and brands to think about how we can close the feedback loop and maybe communicate some information back to the workers so they know where they sit in terms of some of the indicators that they're reporting on. Other more extrinsic incentives would be, for example, credit being sent back into the worker's phone so that for every survey that they take, they receive 2 text messages back, so they can use that credit to send out 2 text messages. But another way to also test and maybe probably the more effective way is the chance to win a certain reward. Then you're not necessarily seeing a lot of people participating and pressing 1111 to a certain question, but rather the incentive to win something normally can limit some of those risks. And then the user experience normally is either through SMS, through text message, or through phone, a voice call. So either the worker would receive a voice call if the supplier has provided the number, or they would call a number that is toll-free. And then they would be guided through a series of questions. So there will be an introduction that ensures that this is free and anonymous. It also will ask them for a language option, so they would actually be able to choose from a variety of languages that they're most comfortable with, which is extremely important for migrant workers, whether internal or international. And then they would go through the series of questions. Normally the answers would be press 1 for yes, 2 for no, 3 for don't know. Sometimes it can vary, like always, sometimes never. And we also we have built-in open-ended question functionality because although that data is really, it takes a lot of time to get through, we see the importance of that. As was already mentioned by AI, there's certain subjective feedback that you receive that you can really not replace with quantitative data. And then real-time monitoring, we use a very similar traffic light system. I think that becomes the standard, which is great. We like standardization because then that means that we can integrate in the future amongst all the different tools that we're building. And one of the key important pieces here is that what suppliers see and we recommend that it is different than what the brands will be able to see. Because to really build supplier ownership, you have to ensure that they don't feel like they're consistently being watched over, that they would be getting phone calls for every report they see, or in 1 week, suddenly the red goes high, and they're freaking out that they might be receiving phone calls from their client, but rather kind of giving a more kind of aggregated level of data to the brand so they can monitor risk, but much more detailed performance indicators to the supplier. So they actually see what the performance is, and they're going to be rectifying it much faster instead of necessarily feeling like they're going to consistently always be sort of reprimanded by the client for some of the indicators that they're receiving, or the performance and indicators they're receiving. And this is how I'm just going to cover very quickly what we think is the opportunity for worker engagement technology and its integration with audits. The continuous improvement sort of possibility is now open because we can have a continuous communication channel with workers, so that it's a system that they can call in at any point in time, whether it's to leave a report or a grievance, or the brand or the supplier can decide to run a survey at any interval, schedule it over time, and pick up on those risks that maybe the audit obviously is not able to pick up because they're not there 24/7, 365 days a year. The audit might go deeper, but then what happens when the auditor is not on the ground is something that can get picked up by the worker engagement technology tool. The risk assessment the digital risk assessments that you can integrate with some of your processes can really kind of complement the interviews. The interviews can be qualitative, they might have more questions, but their sample size will be smaller. Here we're looking at perhaps fewer questions, fewer indicators, but at a higher frequency. Also, for risk, thinking about compliance versus a risk-based approach, real-time reporting is extremely important for a risk-based approach, because if you're going to be expecting risk and monitoring risk over time, you want that data to be as current as possible. And then once you come and you receive information, both from your audits and from your digital engagement, you can actually go back to workers. You already have those workers engaged. Go back and you can validate what those priorities might be, because there might be 10 different issues, but 2 are red, and 8 are amber. So how do you know where to invest the most effort, both as a supplier or as a brand? Then you can sort of validate those priorities back with workers. And once there is a corrective action plan implemented, you can go back to workers and follow up and ask if any of those things have changed, and then you'd be able to track that progress over time. So just a quick kind of case study, and we recently deployed a survey that within the scallop fishing industry in the United States, specifically with migrant labor. There were Vietnamese and Mexican and Portuguese and Cape Verde migrant workers, so majority non-English speakers, who during audits, when the client had executed the audit, was not necessarily prepared to come with 5 different translators. So what we did is we ran a second survey through digital engagement to try to sort of follow up on the priorities that the audit had picked up. And that was extremely valuable, because deploying an auditor just to follow up and validate certain information is expensive. So through digital engagement, you can the cost of deploying these things can be lowered. Now, some of the key benefits of worker engagement technology, if I haven't already mentioned some of them, you can, again, you can achieve a much larger sample size. We're very transparent and honest about your participation rates. We're not going to promise that you'll get 100% or 80% participation rates. They tend to start lower. It takes time for workers to build trust that the system is third party, that the supplier will not find out who they are, that there won't be any repercussion or any sort of fear, I guess, of being targeted if they respond to the survey. So it takes time for them to communicate with each other and kind of validate that this is indeed anonymous. And then in repeat rounds, we always see participation go up. The worker engagement technology can also provide a certain statistical robustness that is really important. That, for example, you can do stratification of different demographics. You can set a confidence interval that you want to achieve. You can also, what is really interesting that you can do now with technology is you can set up your sample size and you say, I want to be able to reach 60% women, 40% men, confidence interval of plus minus 10 or 5, and the surveys will run until it reaches that sample size. So, and there's other ways that you can also set that up. It could be per region, migrant worker, non-migrant worker. You could say, I want to survey at least 60% migrant workers, 40% local, or at least 30% temporary workers, and so on. So stratifying the sample is very interesting, and this is where in the worker survey you begin with some demographic questions, so you can actually automatically come with the data that is pretty robust and has a representation that you're searching for. There is, as I mentioned, quite a marginal cost to adding more workers. So as workers are calling in, or as if, for example, the supplier shares workers' numbers, you're able to add those workers at a very marginal cost. Communication costs of SMS and minutes are pretty low compared to data, so it's still a very affordable solution. And then the continuous monitoring, which is, for us, sort of the driving importance of how this could really complement the audits. If the audits are the snapshots in time and they go quite deep, this is sort of the monitoring that is, over time, perhaps, simple, lean data oriented, but can pick up those risks. So it can be live for an entire year rather than, just certain points in time. And one of the biggest values, and I guess this is a business value as much as an ethical compliance value, is that you are now creating dialogue with groups of workers that had previously been excluded. So in an audit, you might be able to get 15 people in a room. They sometimes are handpicked. It's hard to tell. Sometimes the auditor chooses them, but that depends. Whereas with a technology like this, everybody can participate. It's also multi-channel, so those who have data and want to use the web forms can do that. We're now integrating with WeChat as well. So, and those who don't have data and have simple mobile phones, they are able to use it through SMS or voice. And as I mentioned, it's multilingual, which makes it extremely inclusive. The anonymity is also another piece that obviously will create a certain level of data that is much harder to reach in traditional one-to-one interviews, especially in sensitive information. A recent study showed that digital engagement technology was able to get 9 times more honest answers from workers than one-on-one interviews. So especially on sensitive topics. And the privacy is important. Workers don't have to actually be seen by their supervisor answering questions with the auditor, but they can actually go back in their home and take the survey at their convenience. We have built into the algorithm anti-falsification methods because obviously, as any technology, ours can be fooled and gamed as well. Somebody can call in many times to try to disrupt the analysis and the data, pressing certain numbers randomly. So into the system, we've tried to really build in ways to detect that. So for example, if looking at the timestamp, you'd be able to figure out if the workers are being coached or they're answering questions in front of their supervisor. If, for example, 60 or 50 surveys come in at the exact same time, or the timestamp indicates that they're doing it at the same time, there's likelihood that the supplier, the supervisor is coaching them. Another anti-falsification thing we use is, if somebody presses one number or doesn't finish listening the questions, doesn't listen the full question, then the system would pick it up that they're just answering without necessarily listening. So that is another piece. So we're trying to do some prevention and some detection and pull those outlier data so that it can be reviewed and validated. So this is where really the biggest value comes in. Once you have the data, you don't, as auditors, don't sit on the data. They normally will come and say, these are some of the recommendations to mitigate some of these risks. We also try to integrate that same model where we say suppliers really need the tools to be able to then improve on some of these indicators. So for example, broadening dialogue through broadcasts. So if health and safety or training seems to be insufficient and workers report that, we give this tool to the supplier and say, you can send out mass broadcasts to targeted groups of population on health and safety tips every day, every morning. Or you could be sending out e-learning content from what the auditing firm suggests via short recorded voice messages that every worker will get once a week on a Friday before they enter work, so they can listen to the content at their disposal. So, and it's also interesting, a lot of the supplier development programs that are run by companies, sometimes their impact is also not measured. And worker engagement technology allows for this to happen. So you can always go back to the participants of the program to say, hey, was this actually valuable? Should we continue investing funds into this, or should we go elsewhere? So recently we deployed worker feedback surveys in textile and garment factories in Mexico. And we found interesting statistics specifically on this. The Fair Trade USA was a client, and I will disclose it because it is public. So, but they found that, they have this thing called the Fair Trade Premium. So any factory that is certified by Fair Trade, they receive some funds to do a program to build the capacity of the factory and to improve wellness of workers. So the Fair Trade Premium was spent on certain activities, and they wanted to understand, did we spend the money on the right activities? So then we ran the survey to figure out whether they should continue those programs or look elsewhere. So that was an interesting way to validate whether money was well spent or where it's most needed. And ultimately, it all comes down to being able to have actionable data in your hands. So if you do receive, if you're a supplier and you receive high risk in certain areas of the factory or certain groups, whether it's people running the mills or people stitching, it's important to be able to set up certain tools that continue that dialogue with the worker. One way to do that is kind of a grievance feedback management system that is open 24/7. So a worker at any point can send a question, a report, a grievance. So you would be able to sort of respond to that as it's happening. So we see great value in this, and suppliers have validated this with us time and time again, because they have to set up these systems to be able to work with the brands. They have to have a grievance management system. But oftentimes workers don't use it because they fear that if they bring up an issue, they might see some pushback from their supervisor. So an anonymous tool where they can text an issue or they can leave a message seems to have a much higher rate of success than hotlines or in-face sort of reporting mechanisms. And we've built sort of a collaborative dashboard where different groups of workers within the supplier, different management personnel can work together to collaboratively deal with the issue. And then you can obviously also track progress over time. So touch base with the worker again, say, hey, has the relationship with that supervisor improved? Okay, what are some of the things that we can help with? And you can kind of consistently keep in touch with the worker and tracking remediation over time. We recently launched something of similar nature in Peru, in the extractive sector, we launched in community relations. And so community engagement specialists being able to receive feedback from communities about their operations, about their procurement, about pollution, about a variety of different incidents that could be happening that the community feels tense to actually walk to the mining company and report. And now we'll be kind of taking that over to workers to kind of assess as well what are some of the ways that we can create space for more actionable data with workers as well. And the trend is that we're now starting to standardize sort of the core verification questions, both amongst auditors, there is that trend, and amongst worker engagement technology, looking at what is the most important thing to learn, what are the priorities, and having sets of sort of toolboxes of questions that we can all pull from that are similar will actually provide more comparable data. And data sharing obviously will always lower costs. So if a particular brand realizes that there's 10 other brands sourcing from the same factory, they'll be able to pull in their resources to do worker engagement and receive that risk analysis together at a much lower cost, because they would be able to both take the burden and audit fatigue from the factories and the supplier and the worker, and also lower their cost amongst themselves. And finally, comparability of data and sharing data will allow brands to have access to sort of a scorecard, a supplier scorecard, where suppliers can really be benchmarked and they can be motivated to improve, because they also will have access to this information. We're big believers that for real sustainable change to happen, brands cannot be imposing these tools onto suppliers. Suppliers will have to accept them, that this is the way that things are going. This is what brands are now requesting. And we do see opportunities to standardize some of the grievance processes, training, health and safety notifications. So when suppliers see that value, they're much more likely to also be comfortable with the risk assessment analysis as well. So we're really trying to approach it from a perspective of creating shared value. So anyway, great timing. I'll be here for some questions and stick around after. So thank you again.